This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Hone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today, we're going to take a look at Wheel Effects. These get their name from Wheel of Fortune, a card which makes both players discard their hand and draw 7 cards. For the purposes of this video, I considered a Wheel Effect any symmetrical effect that gets rid of each player's hand and replaces it with 7 new cards. These effects are obviously quite powerful, as drawing 7 cards at a time is a big deal, even if your opponent gets to do the same thing. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points. This includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. At number 10, it is Runehorn Hellkite. It's a 6-mana 5/5 flying dragon, and you can pay 5 generic and a red to exile it from your graveyard, and when you do, each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. The Hellkite is from Commander 2016, so the only 60-card formats it's legal in are Legacy and Vintage. It's gained all of its points in a pretty wacky variant of Legacy Storm that has only recently emerged, one that seeks to chain together a whole bunch of Lion's Eye diamonds and other fast mana. The Hellkite is great for the deck because you can discard it to your diamonds and still have access to the powerful wheel effect from the graveyard, which your diamonds are going to help you pay for. Then the plan is to just chain all of this together, rip through your entire deck, and then win with Grape Shot. One of the nice things about the Hellkite, as opposed to most wheel effects, is it's the only one that is very hard to counter since you don't have to cast a spell to get the effect. The Hellkite looks to be in a reasonable spot to gain some more points, though it remains to be seen whether this Runehorn Hellkite LED Storm variant will last in the long run. At number 9, it is Memory Jar. You can tap and sacrifice this 5-mana artifact, at which point each player exiles all the cards from their hand face down and draws 7 new cards. At the beginning of the next instep, each player discards their hand and returns the exiled cards to their hand. Even if it isn't number 1 on this list, this might just be the most busted of all the wheel effects in the game. It's also one of the most powerful cards in the history of Magic. This is because you can use it in such a way as to keep your opponent from ever taking advantage of the 7 new cards, unlike other wheel effects. This is because both players lose those 7 new cards at the beginning of the instep, so basically this is a less symmetrical version of this effect than most. It is considered one of the most busted cards of all time, as it was the very first card in the history of Magic to get emergency banned, which went down and extended in 1999. It was part of a really awful period in the history of competitive Magic known as Combo Winter, because several stupidly broken cards in Urza's block made combo decks utterly bonkers in every single one of Magic's formats. Memory Jar is one of the most glaring examples. Not only is the card just inherently powerful, there were some stupid powerful combos you could pull off, the most notable of which was combining it with Megrum. There was a ton of free, fast mana just lying around at the time, so you could easily just draw into and cast multiple Memory Jars in the turn, and then at the instep your opponent would discard those cards and Megrum would just kill them. If you're interested in a super deep dive on this insane deck, I did do an entire episode of my deck history series that covers it. Anyway, these days, the only format it's legal in is Vintage, where it is, of course, restricted. It sees sporadic play in the format, usually in combo decks, because it can help you dig so many cards deep in a hurry. It's likely to gain more points in Vintage in the future. At number 8, it is Diminishing Returns. This sorcery costs 2 generic and 2 blue, and it makes each player shuffle their hand and graveyard into the library. Then you exile the top 10 cards of your library, and each player draws up to 7 cards. It's gained all of its points in the Eternal formats, where it usually shows up in combo decks. In Legacy, like a lot of wheel effects, it's been played in Storm decks that are looking to chain a bunch of cheap and free spells together. Wheel effects tend to be a great fit there, since the deck is constructed in such a way that a brand new 7 cards is likely to consist of lots of fast and free spells. It's likely to continue to see play in both formats. At number 7, it is Reforge the Soul. It has the exact same effect as the original Wheel of Fortune. Each player discards their hand and draws 7 cards. However, it costs 2 more mana, unless you cast it for its miracle cost, which actually makes it 1 mana cheaper than the original Wheel. You can only pay the miracle cost, though, when it's the first card you draw in your turn and you reveal it to your opponent. It's another wheel effect that has seen play in Legacy Storm decks, in particular, those that use Birgi, God of Storytelling. She can net you a lot of mana from casting spells, and the new 7 cards you get from Reforge the Soul usually gives you more mana back than you spent, whether or not you cast it for its miracle cost or not. It's also played in modern Goblin Charbelcher decks. To maximize your chances of winning the game with Belcher, these decks usually run 0 to 1 lands. This also makes Recross the Paths quite powerful, as it allows you to stack your entire deck, and you can see how that would be useful with Reforge the Soul, since you can guarantee that you'll cast it for its miracle cost, and then you get to decide what 7 cards you're going to draw, which usually means you're going to combo off. This is another wheel effect that is likely to gain more points. At number 6, it's Time Spiral. This 6-mana sorcery makes each player shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library and then draw 7 cards. After that, you get to untap 6 lands. That last part is a huge addition to a wheel effect. Normally, if you don't have any mana left over after you cast your wheel effect, your opponent is going to get the first crack at using all those sweet new cards, but with Time Spiral, you essentially get to cast it for free. Like Memory Jar, this is a card that was a huge problem during Combo Winter, and you can see why. Also, like the jar, it ended up getting banned or restricted in every single one of Magic's formats. These days, though, it is legal as a 4 of in both Legacy and Vintage, and it's played in Legacy High Tide decks, which look to produce a stupid amount of mana. Obviously, Time Spiral gets even more insane with High Tide, since if you cast it during your turn and you've already cast High Tide, you end up netting mana when your lands untap. It gets especially silly if you have cast multiple High Tides in a turn, which is very possible when you're casting Time Spiral. Once again, this is a wheel effect that's going to keep on gaining points. At number 5, it is Echo of Eons. For 4 generic and 2 blue, this makes all players shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library and draw 7 new cards. It also has Flashback, which lets you cast it from the graveyard for only 2 generic and a blue. It's from Modern Horizons, which means it was never legal in formats like Standard and Pioneer. However, it has done well in the formats it is legal in, especially Legacy. It's of course been used in that format's Storm decks, which we've already covered, but it's also played in Mystic Forge decks that rip through their entire artifact-filled decks and produce lots of mana with free spells like Lion's Eye Diamond, and the combo of the LED with Echo is pretty great because you discard Echo and can pay for its flashback immediately, using the Lion's Eye Diamond mana, which usually means you're going to just keep going off until you win the game. Echo of Eons is in a good spot to keep moving up this list. At number 4, it is Day's Undoing. For 2 generic and a blue, this sorcery makes each player shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library and draw 7 cards. Then, if it's your turn, you end the turn. That last part is meant to balance the cards, since it guarantees that your opponent will get the first crack at the new grip of cards you both have. But a wheel effect for 3 mana that doesn't make you jump through any hoops is a very powerful thing, so for some decks it's worth the downside, especially because pretty much all the decks that have played it in every format run it alongside Narset, Parter of Veils, whose ability makes it so your opponent only gets 1 card. In fact, they often end up going down cards when you cast this and she's in play, since they also lose their hand. This is a nice little combo for control decks that continues to be utilized across multiple formats. At number 3, it is Commit to Memory. This is a split card with Aftermath. You can only cast the Aftermath half when it's in your graveyard, and it's that Aftermath part that is the wheel effect here. Memory costs 4 generic and 2 blue, and has both players shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library and draw 7 cards. While certainly not the most efficient wheel effect, the Commit half makes up for that, because it gives the card an entirely different thing to do when it's in your hand. Commit is an instant that costs 3 generic and a blue, and it lets you put a spell or non-land permanent into its owner's library second from the top. In other words, this can be a removal spell or a pseudo counterspell, and then do the wheel thing later in the game. Unlike every other card on the list, Commit to Memory has done the vast majority of its work in Standard and Pioneer, where it's regularly featured in control decks. It is gaining points more slowly these days than some of the cards behind it, so it is pretty likely to slip down the list in the long run. At number 2, we've got the card that wheel effects are named for, Wheel of Fortune. For 2 generic and a red, this sorcery makes both players discard their hand and draw 7 cards. While not technically part of the Power 9, Wheel of Fortune does have the same legality as those ultra-powerful cards. In other words, it's banned everywhere but Vintage, where it's restricted. Paying 3 mana to draw 7 is of course nuts, and it became pretty clear that the card was simply too good way back in 1994, back during Magic's first year of competitive play when it got restricted. The one copy that is allowed is played in vintage decks, and these days it's often played alongside other wheel effects in decks featuring Hull Breacher and Shieldred the Apocalypse. It's going to keep gaining points, but it's pretty far from being a staple in vintage. And at number 1, it's Time Twister, a wheel effect that is part of the Power 9. It was the first card with this blue style wheel effect we've seen several times on the list. That is that both players shuffle their hand and graveyard into their library and draw 7. In this case, it can do it for only 3 mana. In other words, cards like Days Undoing and Echo of Eons were designed as powered down versions of Time Twister. This is generally considered the weakest of the Power 9, and this is reflected in how heavily it's been played over the years. While cards like Time Walk, Ancestral Recall, and Black Lotus and the Moxen are all staples, Time Twister only shows up in decks where it really makes sense. This usually means combo decks and control decks. It's going to keep gaining points, and it's likely to hold on to its crown as the #1 wheel effect for the foreseeable future. So, those are the top 10 wheel effects in Magic. Are you interested in drawing a brand new hand? If you are, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe if you want more of my content, and check out the playlist that will be on the screen shortly for more MTG Top 10s. Thanks for watching.